Hey, everybody out there. This is Dailies to Downloads. My name is Chad. With me, as always, is Erik. And this time we are going to be talking about documentaries. We're going to be talking about documentaries in parts because there's a lot of meat on the bone when it comes to defining a documentary. But we're going to start with telling you what a documentary is. And that is a movie or television or radio program that provides a factual record or report. That is what you will see if you Google it. Now, if you look on Wikipedia, they will tell you that it's a non-fictional motion picture intended to document reality, primarily for the purposes of instruction, education, or maintaining a historical record. Now, Erik, is that what you think about when you think about a documentary, or do you think the term needs to be more profound and maybe a little bit more elaborate?
Well, I mean, I definitely think it'd probably be more elaborate, but I also understand why you can't have too long of a definition for people to get something. You know what I mean? Like you could spend so much time describing it, and I'm sure we will. But I mean, like, yeah, there is a element of, I don't know. You get into like these very naughty kind of like element of reality. Is like, what does that mean? You know, like you gotta like kind of jump around. Yeah, I mean the educational thing, I think that is almost like a stigma, I don't know, that documentaries may have, that they need to be educational, and that sometimes some people don't like documentaries because it feels like, like you're eating the broccoli and learning something, which is obviously, not the case, but I get it. Sorry, long answer, but I get it as a complete.
So one of the reasons why we wanted to talk about documentaries today is because of a discussion and some buzz surrounding a movie that came out in 2020, which is called Bloody Nose, Empty Pockets. Now, this movie was directed by brothers, Bill Ross IV and Turner Ross, and basically it's a movie that follows the final day in a dive bar called the Roaring Twenties in Las Vegas. And Bloody Nose Empty Pockets has gotten very good reviews. And before I talk about its status as a documentary, I'll just say that I really liked the movie overall. It has, a very authentic quality to it, which we might talk about again. And it really does remind you it really does showcase what life is like for some of the regulars that would go to a dive bar like that. It is you act as almost like another patron in the bar. I want to say a fly on the wall, but I don't really think it's necessarily like a fly on the wall. You are more like a patron. You're observing and listening to various conversations, and that's how it goes. You liked it as well, right, Erik?
Yeah, no, I liked it a lot. I also think that it feels. I'm glad that I never really thought that this would be the subject that I would really, really be interested in, but I am. And we all have like, I feel like, our favorite narrative fiction films that are, barfly and so things that are primarily set in a bar, dive bar, and comes with the demons that someone's wrestling with, and they wind up at this place and blah blah blah. We've all seen that kind of movie. But it's interesting to, take the traditional final day of so and so business, right? Final day of whatever, and then apply it to this. And it definitely, like, yeah, you make a good point that you do kind of feel like you're a participant and patron of the place. And I think that's also something that comes with the people being comfortable, right? I mean, they're comfortable with being filmed. There must have been so much preparation and just time spent with these people so that, and that's actually what makes it ideal. Obviously, a dive bar is going to have regulars, and it's going to always have the same quote unquote characters, right? Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot.
Right. And so when I saw this movie, I went into it knowing that it was at Sundance and it was actually nominated for the Grand Jury Prize at Sundance in 2020 in the documentary category. So when I sat down to watch it, I simply thought that it was a documentary. But then after it was done, at least the ticket that I got, the digital ticket that I got, had interviews with the directors at the end, and they talk a lot about the making of the movie, and they themselves interview some of the people in it. And basically, a lot of the people in this documentary, if you want to call it that, are actors. And this dive bar is not in Las Vegas. It's not. This dive bar is actually in New Orleans. Whether or not it was the actual final day of this place, I don't know. Does seem like it. So basically, this is a staged movie, and that's like when I thought about it. Initially, I was a little irritated, but then the more I thought about it, I was like, well, does this matter? Does this matter in terms of how I feel about the movie? And at the end of the day, I decided it doesn't. I still like what I saw. However, it is worth talking about how this has been labeled as a documentary. If you read some reviews, they might say that it's a blend of a documentary and something else. But this has appeared in many festivals in the documentary category. It has won. It won the True Vision Award at the True False Film Fest as a documentary. And although I really like the movie, and you might even hear me talk about it at the end of the year, in my opinion, in no way is this a actual documentary. When you have a cast and they are actors and the situation is staged, it fails to be what I consider, at least, to be a documentary. It becomes a film, which is fine. And although it's interesting to hear the directors talk about their childhood and being with their dad in dive bars, and that's where they got the inspiration, I think that's great, and it's really cool to hear. It's just odd to me that this is in categories of documentary. What do you think?
So I don't know as much about some of the stuff you mentioned, the production, like some of the background stuff. So did they say, is it scripted, or did they come up with the scenario?
It's not scripted. From what I was able to tell, it's simply staged. And a lot of these people in the movie play themselves with their own names. Now, I'm assuming it seems heightened versions of themselves. It seems like they might have been given some direction of, where to go, but basically it's just kind of a improv situation. So it would almost be like, if you're going to see, in Chicago, like the Second City, which a lot of that is, there's a lot of improv there. It would be weird if you went to see that and said, well, they're doing a documentary here.
Yeah.
It's simply, they're actors and they were hired to portray what it would be like to be locals going to a dive bar that's about to close down.
Yeah, I guess for me, I think, I wonder if I didn't know that, like, like if they didn't put on this special feature or whatever, when you're hearing a lot of people are going to go to a movie and obviously never read anything else about it or never do any more research or et cetera, et cetera. I do think that it's always good to have that extra context, of course. Whether or not the film gives it to you is a little different. Like, in a way, these are the same things that have look at, like, Nanook of the North, right? What we would call, like, the prototypical, one of the founding fathers of documentary film, right? And yet that is, those Canadian Inuits are not, they're doing customs that are not of the time period. They're not shot in the 1920s, but they're doing customs from like the 1800s, and the whole. I think like they drove there. Like, it was not as archaic and tribal as the movie makes it out to be, but they were performing, and their customs of previous generations. But if anyone is to watch that movie today and not do any Googling, they wouldn't know that.
And this is what
definitely context matters. I just sometimes wonder to what extent. extent that is the responsibility of the filmmaker. At the same time, it sounds like having it not be scripted, it also it is that kind of gray line. Like, yeah, like you said, the word hybrid is kind of just the catch-all. Like, hybrid, it's something and something else, and whatever. That kind of like get in, like Sundance has like what they call the next section, which is kind of like, we don't know what to place this in. It's a little bit of everything. It's a sound performance piece. It's about so yeah, it definitely doesn't. I mean, to me, it doesn't change the experience necessarily of watching the film. Of course, context is always going to matter, and what you bring to it or what you don't. And it's when you mentioned like people are playing themselves. In a way, obviously, every documentary is that, because you're hopefully they know they're being filmed, right? Unless
Right.
it's some other means. But once you know the camera's on, of course, you're gonna tense up, perform. You're conscious that you're being filmed. So you think of some of the great ones that follow politicians. They're always on camera. They always know how to turn it on. They always know. So are those like less authentic because of that scenario? Primary and like JFK following him around. He knows he's being filmed. He's always being filmed. Is that any less authentic or realistic than how he is by himself without cameras on? Like, probably, it is.
Probably a little
Yeah.
bit, for sure. I mean, like you said, people act differently when they're on camera.
Yeah.
My response would be JFK probably didn't think he was being hired as an actor necessarily, which is what I think separates this. But you had talked about, when Nanook of the North, which kind of gets into a whole like another category of talking about documentaries, which is when they label something as a documentary and not everything in that documentary is factual. At what point, and you were talking about context, at one point when the filmmaker is trying to show a certain message or trying to get across a certain point, but is leaving out some details or not telling you everything that he's showing you, at what point is that deceiving? Now, in the terms of Bloody Nose, Empty Pockets, they do not hide anything about the film I mean, it was, I guess you would label it as like a bonus feature in the ticket that I got, but they're very upfront about what it is. They're not trying to hide anything, but for whatever reason, it's being labeled as a documentary. And you had talked about hybrid, films, and there is a whole section of hybrid documentaries, which we'll probably talk about in another show. And I would understand that being labeled as a hybrid if any part of it was a documentary. If this was actually a bar that was closing down in Las Vegas and these were actually the people, but he brought them back to, kind of showcase them reenacting it, I would understand that in a way, because there's documentaries that do things in that way.
Yeah.
But
the act of killing, right? Is pretty
right, which but this is it's weird how this has kind of gotten described, and as we'll talk in other shows all about some of the documentaries that are simply trying to get a certain message across, and they are going to convey that message regardless of whether or not they tell the whole story.
Sure.
And that's how I'll give my final thoughts on this particular episode.
Are you telling me that Triumph of the Will is not about a great World War II army that was doing great stuff for good people? Oh my!
Right?
Oh.
Yeah, propaganda documentaries are their own thing. Absolutely.
Dinesh D'Souza comes out with a new Trump one every 2 years. I can't take it for its word. It's like,
right, yeah. And that's sometimes the frustrating thing is a lot of people probably watch documentaries thinking everything that they are seeing is completely 100% truthful.
Yeah.
And that's not always the case. The definition of a documentary, which is how we started out, has broadened and gotten a little bit more complex over the years. It's not just a documentary that you were shown in school and that's what a documentary is, or something you see on the Discovery Channel. it can be a lot of different things. There can be a documentary that mixes fact and fiction. There can be a documentary that's a hybrid. There can be a documentary that's no words. All of these different types of documentaries exist out there. And so I'll end my thoughts on it by just talking about what I look for in a documentary, which is I recognize that like a movie like Fahrenheit 9/11 or Searching for Sugar Man are certainly documentaries, but what I look for usually is a documentary that even if the filmmaker has an opinion, which obviously they're going to have an opinion, they should provide that stance, but I do prefer them to try to be neutral, to try to give both sides of the story so that then I can make my own decision on it. Those are the documentaries I personally like the best and go to the best. How about you?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that is a good distinction to make too, of that of being objective as much as humans can be. Of course, we can't, like, we're seeing the world the way we see it, and we try to think we're being objective, but of course, there's more to learn always, right? But as in the idea of objectivity doesn't necessarily mean that you are being passive, I guess, right? Like that doesn't mean that I'm not going to ask. Like we're seeing that a lot, just to kind of this whole idea of nonfiction and journalism, right? It's that like if you ask a question and to a subject and they deny it or ignore it or just distract from it, like it's okay to prod further. I see a lot of people just asking a question, and we get, unfortunately, we get that fake news that's not real, and then they move on. And it's like, well, that's not journalism either. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
that's not objective. Then you do need to take a side if you are. I'm just using this one example because it's everywhere now. Just because you are having someone that's going to completely deflect and battle truth, right? So then you're going to have to be. The objectivity is sometimes harder to maintain because objectivity to certain people is allowing them to spread the propaganda, right? You kind of go into those places. That is like the Lenny Riefenstahl kind of thing. It's like, were
Right.
you complicit by not prodding further? Or are you, a great filmmaker because of the way you shot it and the way you presented it? Of course, context is everything for something like that, right? And yeah, sorry, I don't really, I don't know if I have an answer, uh, but yeah, obviously we come to everything with our own biases and subjectivity. I think to deliberately leave something out would be a little immoral, I guess.
Right.
But of course, there are going to be things that you want to focus on more than others because of that's just your own personal interest, and that's human.
Is there a style of documentary that you look at more often than not? Is there certain filmmakers that you like their style more, or do you just like to be entertained, or how is it that you prefer them to be? Like when you find out, for instance, that well they left this part completely out, and that changes the whole scope of the documentary and the message that they were trying to send. Like how do you, like for instance, I always feel a little angry when I find out stuff like that. Searching for Sugar Man is a very good example. They portray that musician in that documentary as a recluse whom they rediscovered,
Yeah,
and that is not true. He had toured, you know, all those years that they
yeah,
claim that he just was holed up in his house, but they want you to think that they dug him out of this hole
yeah,
and reintroduced him to the world, and that's simply not true. So it's like that kind of thing is really annoying to me. I don't
yeah,
understand. And that movie won awards. So, I guess mission successful. It's obvious that when you do something like that, it can win awards. But when
yeah.
I have to read more about the documentary I'm seeing, and then I discover things that change my opinion entirely, I think to myself, wow, could they have put that in? Should they have put that in?
Yeah, and I guess that like all they definitely have. I give them full range to the filmmakers to create a story. Like they're storytellers at the end of the day, right? Like you come out of a movie, a documentary, or any kind of like entertained or whatever you felt, right? Like even the exit through the gift shop, right? Which becomes something that you don't realize it is, and then it becomes the yeah. But I had a great experience. I
Yeah,
couldn't tell you exactly what or how I felt, but it was a ride that I enjoyed taking.
right. We don't know what it
And
was, but it was great, whatever it was.
whatever it was, and and that's a film where they're deliberately withholding information for a reason, and it's like it's creating a mystery within itself, and then it's revealing things, and then you're a little confused, but then it reveals something else. So that is different, like deliberately withholding information in a storytelling uh justification, I think is fine. I do think that, yes, if they are creating a completely, that's a pretty good example of being a recluse, but he's not a recluse and he's not, that would be strange. You'd wonder why they even would go down that route.
Right, it's weird because like I looked it up and I was like, oh wow, this guy he was a folk singer, and I was like, wow, this guy is good music. Let me look up some of the stuff that he's done, and then I looked that up, and I'm like, wait, he has this concert on YouTube, and
Yeah, then
he made this albums, and like he was primarily a musician, and I think, don't quote me, but I think it was Australia, but he was still doing stuff. Like he
yeah,
wasn't like that's still a place on the planet, and he was still recording. So it just struck me as really weird. It's like, well, they got their message across, and people bought it,
yeah,
but I felt I felt manipulated in a bad way, and
yeah,
sometimes it can be manipulated in a good way. But
yeah.
in this way,
That's
I just
like
left
yeah.
it thinking, a very like I don't know, kind of a sour taste in my
Yeah.
mouth.
Well, when you find out the actual context, it's like, so why is this guy important? What's the point of this? Like
Right.
they're not doing it for a reason that rewards the viewer. It's just creating importance for itself, I guess, for existing as a story in a
And
way.
Exit Through the Gift Shop is, I mean that's a great documentary. I do feel like it's kind of in its own class. I don't know of any other documentary that kind of struck me how that one did, and was filmed in such a way. It really was unique. You know,
Yeah, and I was just starting to think of that, like Chris Marker, who was a great documentary filmmaker in the '70s and the '80s, and something like Sans Soleil, which was a feature that he made in the early '80s, which is all footage that he shot, and it has a voiceover narration by a woman who's writing letters to a lover of hers, and it's a voiceover of these letters. And only in a class did I find out that that woman doesn't exist. The director wrote these letters, and he had an actress read the letters. Now he filmed everything you see in the movie. He filmed. It's real. It's Japan. It's Tokyo. He's walking through Tokyo, but we're getting fictitious letters from a woman who doesn't exist that he created, and he wrote the letters, and an actress reads them. It's
so
it, it,
how'd you feel when you learned that?
um I wasn't like upset because like I didn't know who this woman was anyway. So finding out that she didn't exist, it didn't let me down because I don't. Why does it? You know what I mean? Why does it matter? Like I then when I would revisit the film, rewatch the film, knowing that context, then I would be paying attention more to the words, because if it's deliberately written to maybe match images or whatever else, then I kind of see it streamlined, because that is the filmmaker controlling all aspects in a way that I didn't know the first time, and that
Right.
it never revealed. I don't know. That didn't bother me, just because again, it's not like this is Abraham Lincoln's letters, so I have an actual person to associate that with, right? I mean, this is a person that he made up that doesn't exist, and then you know, I don't know. Like,
I'll have to watch that. I have not seen that.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I'll reserve judgment until I
okay,
actually see it. But
sure,
I
sure,
have heard of that movie. It's one that I certainly need to check
yeah,
out. And one of the filmmakers that comes to mind, who I almost always like his stuff, and I haven't watched. I think some of the recent documentaries that he's made is Werner Herzog. To me, he is always a person who makes interesting documentaries, and he'll certainly give his opinion, and he will show you where he stands, but he also tries to tell the whole story. And I think that he does it in a way that doesn't feel forced, that gives you both sides of the coin, but also unravels things in a very interesting, profound way.
yeah, yeah. I think that, and he's yeah, has an artistic voice, and Maybe next week we'll get into why I don't like Ken Burns, or at least in the watching as a book report, as a cinematic book report. I guess they're okay, but
We'll definitely
yeah,
get into Ken Burns because
yeah.
he's one of my heroes, as we've talked about, off camera. But yes, next week we'll get into talking about some of the other documentary categories that are out there. There's docudramas, there's docufiction, there's hybrid documentaries. There's a lot of different things to talk about, and just why the term documentary is very widespread and multifaceted these days. So thank you very much for tuning in, and hopefully you will join us next week.